Welcome to you all, and thanks so much for joining us this evening. Now, the IOE's Professorial public lectures provide a welcome opportunity to celebrate and share the expertise of our senior colleagues. Each lecture is free and open to everyone, staff, students, and of course the public as well. Our speaker this evening is Jan Derry, Professor of Philosophy of Education at the UCL Institute of Education. And this year, Jan celebrates her 26th year at the IOE. Jan joined the Institute in 1992 as tutor on the Social Studies and Humanities PGCE and worked in that area for a following 10 years. It was in 2005 that Jan moved to a post more squarely focused on the philosophy of education to reflect her research focus, and she took on a full-time role then as lecturer in philosophy. And in 2014, Jan was conferred professor. Jan's research considers philosophical psychology, the connection between epistemology and pedagogy, and the nature of professional expertise and judgment. She has a particular interest in the philosophical work of Brandom, known as inferentialism, and its concern with meaning, in this case, the meaning-making of learners. In introducing Jan, I should also note her other vital contribution to the foundation discipline of the philosophy of education, her co-directorship of the Centre for Philosophy at the IOE. Due to the IOE's history, scale, and breadth, it has an important role in maintaining the integrity and development of the discipline of education and education research, not least through its support for the foundation disciplines, of which, of course, philosophy of education is one. The Centre for Philosophy provides a focal point for this work, drawing together a variety of philosophical approaches to address topics from the aims of education to the curriculum, teaching and learning, inclusion, democracy, citizenship, right through to new technologies and neuroscience. Typically, the questions that these topics raise lead back to considerations of the nature of knowledge, what characterizes a just society, and the nature of the good life. And it's philosophical inquiry that can unlock these questions for us. The focus of this evening's lecture is the enduring debate in education on the place of knowledge in the curriculum. It will show how a philosophical lens can help us open up the black box of learning, in the process perhaps helping to unite those who prioritize the learning of subject knowledge and those whose primary concern is learners making their own meaning, or at least to help us transcend some of those binaries. So, can I invite Jan to present her lecture? Jan.
Thank you, Becky. And I should just mention that I haven't quite chalked up the 50 years that some people have at the Institute, but I did manage to escape for about a year and a half. The attractions of working with Anne Edwards and Harry Daniels at the University of Birmingham led me there, but I couldn't miss the attractions of the Institute. And when they went off, Anne to Oxford and Harry to Bath, I decided I must come back. And the wonderful thing about this place is the critical mass, the very large number of staff working in so many different areas here. Anyway, I hope you'll enjoy the topic tonight. It's very topical. We're very fortunate to have Michael Young here as the respondent. As many of you know, if not all of you know here, there's an intense disagreement in education circles between those who favour flat facts and disciplines on the one side and those whose main concern is meaning-making and epistemic access on the other. This echoes a 50-year-old debate. It's actually about 55 years because the Richard Peters lecture was in 1963 at initiation and education, or education as initiation. And Richard Peters held the chair in philosophy of education. Anyway, this echoes a debate which has gone on for 50 years, and the Institute played a central role. Among those involved were sociologists Young, Whitty and Bernstein, educationalists in the field of English teaching, Britton and Rosen, and the philosophers of education, Peters and Hurst. Today, the debate has different political dimensions to an extent. On the one side, nostalgia for instruction of disciplines, and on the other, unqualified conviction that education should involve individual expression. My aim here is to question the limitations of these views by examining knowledge. Both schools of thought have this as their goal, but neither systematically examines what it is. In other words, my aim is to address the question concerning education philosophically. I should say my colleagues, Michael Young and also Joe Muller, do examine knowledge to a great extent, and I'm sure Michael will say something about that. Among many issues here, it raises the question of meaning. How does meaning come about? How is it that words can represent things and thought makes sense to others? Of course, we're familiar with the idea that the meaning of words changes over time and with context. The word wicked was commonly used to refer to evil. Now it's used to mean superb. But how does meaning develop? And how, the crucial question here, does it relate to understanding? Wittgenstein addresses the question of what it is to mean something through an instruction to teach children a game. Someone says to me, "Show the children a game," and I teach them gambling with dice. And the other says, "I didn't mean that sort of game." Is it necessary for the thought that gambling is excluded to be present when the instructions show the children the game is given? Similar questions are fundamental to education, because in the absence of carefully considered meaning, the result may be rote learning of meaningless terms without understanding. And I'm just going to show you a small piece from the physicist Richard Feynman talking about meaning.
Feynman is in the forefront of one of the oldest and most intriguing games of hide-and-seek in science, finding the ultimate constituents of the world. In this search, Feynman is a celebrated maverick who was encouraged by his father, a New York clothing salesman, to confront conventional wisdom.
One Sunday, all the kids were all walking in little parties with their fathers in the woods. Then the next Monday, we were playing in a field, and the kid said to me, "Say, what's that bird? What's the name of it? Do you know the name of that bird?" I says, "I haven't the slightest idea." He said, "Well, it's a brown-throated thrush." He says, "Your father doesn't teach you anything." But my father had already taught me about the names of birds. Once we walked and he says, "That's a brown-throated thrush." He says, "Know what the name of that bird is? A brown-throated thrush." In German, it's called a Flügelflögel. In Chinese, it's called a Tinglong-tong. In Japanese, a Tohlachtohara, and so on. And when you know all the names in every language of that bird, you know nothing, but absolutely nothing about the bird. And then we would go on and talk about the pecking and the feathers. So I had learned already that names don't constitute knowledge. It's knowing the name of something. That's caused me a certain trouble since, because I refuse to learn the name of anything. So when someone comes in and says, "You got any explanation for the Fitz-Clonan experiment?" I says, what's that? He says, "You know, that the long-lived K-meson disintegrates into 2 pies. Oh, yes, now I know. But I never know the names of things. What he forgot to tell me was that knowing the names of things is useful if you want to talk to somebody else. So you tell him what you're talking about.
But the basic principle of knowing about something rather than just knowing its name is something that you stuck to, is it?
Yes, of course. You have to learn. These are kind of disciplines in the field of science that you have to learn. That to know when you know and when you don't know, and what it is you know and what it is you don't know. And it's you got to be very careful not to confuse yourself.
So Feynman's very interesting because he's talking about knowledge here, and he's talking about it in a rather unusual way. He's talking about relations between things giving meaning, but not the actual names themselves, as it were. He's interested in the relations. So although he recognizes that the name of a phenomenon is necessary for communication, his focus was elsewhere. What is it that he's getting to grips with in the absence of names for things? So Feynman understands the meaning of words and concepts can only be understood through relations. It's a little bit hard to get a grip on what this actually means, but I hope as we go along it'll become clearer. Put this way, even when expressed in simplified terms, this brings out an important feature about meaning. Though a representation may appear to convey meaning on its own, there is always prior to it what makes understanding possible. As I will go on to explain, this is the inferential relations that connect concepts, enabling representations to represent. When he discusses inferentialism, the philosophical ideas informing my lecture, Peregrine asks, how is it that we have the peculiar ability to let one thing stand for another? He continues, how we do it and what the relationship so established consists in is very difficult to explain in a non-mysterious way. So in many ways, we take this for granted. How we do this is central to education. How do we convey meaning? What knowledge form should be taught? How do students access meaning? And how do they make sense of what is meant? For Robert Brandom, the philosopher whose work has most influenced my argument here, the distinctive characteristics of human beings, of giving and taking reasons, is central to any account of meaning and to being in touch with the world. Brandom illustrates his argument by contrasting a parrot squawking red in the presence of red objects and a human reporter. We could compare the parrot with a young child saying red. Unlike the parrot's response, the child's response involves reason as she situates the concept red in a network of other concepts. She knows that in uttering the word red, neither blue nor yellow nor any other colour is entailed. In Hegelian terms, the red is determined by the negation of blue and yellow. It's delimited by what it is not. So while the parrot's response is restricted to the red object, the child is responsive to those determinate relations despite not knowing much about colours. So although the child may not be consciously aware or able to articulate that they're responsive to those relations, they're becoming responsive to them as they mature. And I want to suggest that these relations have some connection with what Feynman's interested in. Brandom's colleague at the University of Pittsburgh, John McDowell, calls it a good gloss on one notion of freedom. This is a more powerful statement than it appears. It refers to something about our relation to the world that makes us free rather than being tied to a specific niche. It enables us to produce not only our own environment, but art, literature, and science, even the science that may ultimately be used to save the planet. Even more than this, it allows us to bootstrap our intellects, and this is what makes education so important. For policymakers, an important feature of contemporary education is a lack of serious attention to knowledge. Thus, they deprecate the attention given to meaning-making and advocate a return to knowledge as priority. But what they mean by knowledge is unclear, and it's precisely the problem that is considered here. The author whose work is central to the issue is E.D. Hirsch, renowned for his focus on facts. He argues that memorization is valuable and that young children love learning facts. In his early influential work, Cultural Literacy, he argued that many students had been deprived of crucial knowledge which should be emphasized in teaching. And he used the phrase core knowledge to capture the significance of what he believed needed to be taught. Importantly, his influence has not been restricted to North America, and it's encouraged the British government to put knowledge at the centre of education. This might not seem unreasonable. Surely schools are concerned with imparting knowledge, but things are not so straightforward, as the conception of knowledge is not clearly defined. What presuppositions enter into thinking about knowledge? Facts may seem to be just that. A fact is a fact. Clearly, when we state a fact, our utterance stands for something. The statement, "it's hot," refers to the temperature. It stands for a state of affairs, the temperature in the room. If it is a fact rather than simply an opinion or even a belief, it should have to be accepted as such. Thomas Kuhn, in the foreword to Ludwig Fleck's 1935 monograph, The Genesis and the Development of a Scientific Fact, reports one reaction to the title of the book, that a fact is a fact. The person said, a fact is a fact. It has neither genesis nor development. But this claim is misleading. Many facts have a history, and this is relevant to how learners access them. Simply memorizing them stops well short of understanding them. There are two important issues concerning facts in the current debate. The first concerns the value of learning facts without understanding them, and the second relates to teaching the form of knowledge needed to understand them. Yandell, reacting to the emphasis placed on facts by government ministers, questions the idea that learning can involve the ingestion or appropriation of specified gobbets of intellectual capital, drawing on a rich vein of work challenging notions of standard English by stressing the logic in non-standard English. Yandell questions how the knowledge prescribed for the school curriculum can be considered common to all. And he says, by some process of alchemy, knowledge simultaneously belongs to all and becomes the property of individuals. The question becomes a problem of knowledge rather than how knowledge is conceived. It leads to whose knowledge question that contests curricula on the basis that they serve the interests of the powerful. Michael Young argued for the need to move away from the whose interest question and use the expression powerful knowledge to consider how knowledge is conceived. Despite Young's own resistance, however, the expression is often connected with Hirsch's core curriculum, and I think he would have some reservations about that. The knowledge that Hirsch argues is essential for everyone, and this is to do with whether it's interpreted, or Hirsch's work is interpreted in terms of teaching facts as though they were representations and stood for things. It's here that a problem related to knowledge lies. The discussion is insufficiently fine-grained, and the issues implicitly recognized by authors are not brought out in the open. If we turn to those concerned with government policy, such as Gibb, we see a reaction against using lessons for meaning-making. Gibb questions whether this is an effective use of lesson time. His arguments are supported by Kirshner and his co-authors, who argue that inquiry learning, the pedagogic approach that places emphasis on learners making their own sense of material, is doomed to fail. However, the reasons that Kirshner provides for the failure are related to cognition and specifically to the limitations in short-term memory. My reasons are different, though actually not unconnected, and they relate to the fundamental question of how it is that we're able to let one thing stand for another in the first place. To illustrate my point, let us consider an example which, on the face of it, appears to support Gibb and Kirshner's criticism of an emphasis on meaning-making. The example comes from religious education. The topic of the lesson was the Bible, and the aim was to foster understanding and appreciation of the practices and beliefs of different faith communities. To assist students in understanding what the Bible is and how it functions, the lesson was designed to get students to make some sense of the Bible for themselves by being asked to construct a Bible of their own, and in doing so to use headings from a list which included the title, laws, and prophecy. The teacher attempted to create conditions where students could learn by doing. However, the children made different Bibles, including a fashion Bible, in which the concept of law was illustrated with fashion pictures accompanied by rules at which it's acceptable to wear, rules about the age at which you can wear certain items of clothing. The concept of prophecy in the fashion Bible becomes predictions of the financial viability of particular clothing shops and whether or not they would survive. It's understandable that a teacher should try to stimulate interest in students who are studying an area that may appear meaningless and pointless. In this case, the teacher was attempting to generate interest by moving beyond the mere facts of the Bible to help the students understand something of its religious importance. But in this case, where meaning-making was emphasized, The students learnt nothing of the Bible. So the issue here is knowledge as well as meaning-making. Paul Nurse's account of his experience as a doctoral researcher helps here. Nurse is an eminent geneticist and director of the Francis Crick Institute, of which UCL was a founding member. He relates his experience of undergoing an intellectual crisis as a second-year graduate student. That crisis was making, this is his words, that crisis was making me contemplate abandoning my already rather short career as an experimental scientist. I was working on cells, the basic unit of life, but things were not going particularly well. The problem was not carrying out my experiments, it was deciding what experiments I should do and how I could build on the results of those experiments. What I was doing was measuring the levels of different chemicals in cells in a rather random sort of fashion. And it was not really clear to me as to why this was important. And it was why this was important and how it was telling me anything interesting about how cells worked. I could not see how to proceed from the data I was gathering to the ideas of more general interest about the working of cells. So Nurse explains that he was contemplating giving up his studies. I think this is what a lot of doctoral students go through at some point, the sort of crisis of the intellect, and moving instead to the study of philosophy and the history of science. And for this reason, he started reading Karl Popper's work, whose ideas provided him with a way out of his intellectual crisis. So he continues, the problem was that I was trying to advance my research by first gathering too much data, as much data as I could, and then look for generalities or patterns from which I could generate a higher level theory to explain what was happening. I had another difficulty, a more theoretical one, related to the issue of induction. That is, how to infer from specific particulars to generalities, to make general inferences made upon particular results. Nurse appreciated that this was a classical philosophical problem, most often connected with Hume. More practically, I could not work out what experiments to do, and I was gradually sinking under a mass of data and making no progress. I was getting depressed. So Nurse explains that Popper helped him to see a way out of his dilemma, and he quotes Popper. Without waiting passively for repetitions to impress or impose regularities, so this is Popper, upon us, we actively try to impose regularities upon the world. We try to discover similarities in it and to interpret it in terms of laws invented by us. Without waiting for premises, we jump to conclusions. These may have to be discarded later should observations show that they're wrong. He took Popper to be recommending that he should attempt to generate a conceptual framework for understanding the experimental observations through intuitive leaps of the imagination. What was counterintuitive was the idea that the framework should be tested through trial and error, discarded if necessary, but that the important insight was that errors were involved in advancing knowledge. Now, I'm using it slightly differently because I think this highlights a significant issue about the relation of a representation to the data that it attempts to represent, i.e. the dynamic aspect involved in representing. The use to which Nurse puts Popper's method is relevant to the conception of knowledge in education. To avoid viewing data in a random sort of fashion and to get to grips with what they could show him, Nurse needed a conceptual system which allowed him to test how the data functioned in relation to the model he was emphasizing. It was only then he could make meaning of the data. This particular account of scientific practice illustrates what is meant by what I'm calling mediating activity, because he was mediating his contact with the data, and he was using a conceptual framework. So it went beyond seeing the data representationally as so many separate instances to providing a system of related concepts through which to make sense of the data. So when Vygotsky discusses the intellectual development of young children in relation to Piaget's arguments, he insists that it's only within a system that deduction is possible. Without such a system and the constraints it involves, inquiry is open-ended, vague, and ultimately empty. The line of argument is a vital feature of Vygotsky's discussion of concept meaning. At various points in his work, Vygotsky rejects the conception of thought in taking a representational or simply referential relation to the world. The point he stresses is that the idea, and this is Vygotsky's quote, the idea of general representations is inadequate to express the role of a concept in thinking. We must seek the psychological equivalent of the concept, not in general representations. We must seek it in the system of judgments in which the concept is disclosed. So in effect, what he's saying is that the representations can't be understood independently. They have to be understood as part of a system of concepts, as related to different concepts. So in effect, what Nurse is directing attention to is that meaning is constituted via such a system in which the meaning of one concept is dependent on its relationship to others. Even in the Wittgenstein example I used at the beginning, the very fact that we know you shouldn't teach children to gamble when you're asked to teach them a game means that we've already placed the concept of teaching them a game in a particular set of other concepts. And that's why we know don't start getting them to gamble when you're just simply asked to teach them a game. And this is something very important and distinctive about human beings. So as Brandon puts it, one cannot have one concept without having many. Of course, the parrot doesn't have a concept. The parrot can utter red without it relating to anything else, but a human being can't. The idea that to have one concept, it is necessary to have many, appears to present a learning paradox. How is it possible for the learner to come to know a concept when this knowledge depends on other concepts that she does not already know? So this is a classic problem mentioned in relation to Plato's Socratic dialogue. A commonly accepted step in teaching is to break the object of study down into simpler elements. Start with the simple and move to the complex. But given the proposition that the meaning of one concept is dependent on its relation to other concepts, Vygotsky's work suggests a radically different approach. If it were the case of training pigeons to respond to stimulus, such that the inscription turn, then breaking down, worked, and then breaking down the content down into smallest units, that sort of approach would be essential. So, sorry, I jumbled it up a little bit there. So we can think of a pigeon responding to this stimulus turn. If the initial Sorry, and I'm just going to show you a little bit of video here.
You might define reading as the ability to emit an appropriate differential response to written commands. On the other hand, if you saw a pigeon do this, you might not. Originally, this was a hue discrimination. The word peck was printed in red and the word turn in black. We gradually blackened the letters of peck as discrimination training proceeded.
So what the commentator's speaking about there is he's saying if we thought of reading as a differential response to a stimulus, then we might think the pigeon is reading. And obviously that raises very interesting questions that my colleague Andrew Davies has written extensively on about the nature of reading. If initial awareness were restricted to a representation, and only after that had been grasped that we could then make inferences, it would be reasonable to break knowledge down into units and adopt a building blocks approach, like they did when they trained the pigeon to turn to the inscription turn. However, human responsiveness is clearly different to that of a pigeon. And if the distinctive characteristic of the nature of our contact with the world is not taken into account, then we will surely fail to educate. Following Vygotsky, rather than introducing the learner to an accumulation of simple elements, we're encouraged to start by introducing learners to a rich domain in which they can begin to make sense of what follows from what, in which their responsiveness to the relevant reasons and relations that constitute concepts can develop. The reasons for approaching knowledge in this way, by involving many concepts at the start, is specifically attuned to the human ability to make one thing stand for another. So what I'm trying to establish here is that we don't think enough about what's involved in making one thing stand for another. When we begin to open up that sort of can of worms and we realize it's very, very different to any other life form, We then need to pay attention to that in how we think about bringing somebody into a knowledge domain. And that doesn't mean that they have to see the complexity of the domain immediately, but it does mean that the teachers have to have that in their mind when they're introducing students to ideas within a particular area. So Brandon was mentioned earlier in connection to the distinction between the responsiveness of a human and a parrot. The parrot simply squawked red on seeing a red object, and yet a child, though using the same word, already understands red is not green or blue. A modification of this example of Brandon stresses this distinctive quality of humans, and this brings to the fore issues involved in initiating learners into a field of knowledge. Brandon contrasts the response to a fire by a human with that of a fire alarm. Both make warning sounds in response to the fire. At first sight, the human shout fire and the shrill ring of the alarm appear the outcome of a causal chain of effects. However, Brandon sees these responses as taking a different form. A child shouting fire already has some awareness of its implications. She already appreciates consequences of the exclamation fire, while the alarm does no more than respond mechanically to the physical conditions. Brandon uses this example to illustrate his argument that what distinguishes the human form of knowing from the type of knowing we can ascribe to a machine or to a lower life form consists not just in expressing a response, but in our mastery of the practices of giving and asking for reasons, in which our responses can play a role as justifying beliefs and claims. Now, of course, the child's not in a position to do all of that, particularly if they're a young child, but the argument is they're responsive to the conditions in which reasons can be given. For Brandon, making a report as a human being goes beyond responding differentially. That is to say, humans respond to reasons. And this is very important. The reasons are not arbitrary. They're interconnected with each other within a system of concepts. Thus, the meaning of the fire depends on its relation to a whole set of other concepts to which the child must be responsive. The example of Buridan's ass, used by Vygotsky, gives further illustration of our particular relation to the world and returns us to the idea that we mediate our activity rather than simply responding to stimuli. Buridan's ass involves a donkey, it's a rather funny example, faced with two equally sized, equidistant bales of hay, starving as a result of being unable to choose between them. It was used by Buridan to explore an ancient problem of how humans react to situations, and in particular, whether they act as an object does to force without free will. So he was interested in the issue of free will. Vygotsky connects the problem to a literary example from Tolstoy's War and Peace, where Pierre is faced with the torturous decision of whether to enlist in the army or remain in Moscow. And Vygotsky explains that Tolstoy shows that a man who finds himself in a Buridan's situation looks for help in artificially introduced auxiliary motives or stimuli. Toss a coin, and in that way, master the situation. Vygotsky, of course, recognizes that the example, though simple, provides an insight into the intellect. Man himself creates stimuli that determine his response and uses these stimuli as devices for mastering processes of his own behavior. So this is a very important idea about mediation here and our responses being different to machines or lower life forms. In Vygotsky's account, by attributing significance to artificially instituted stimuli, humans free themselves from the compulsory binding power of nature and attribute significance to external artifacts. A dice thrown to make a choice, a knot tied in a cloth to prompt memory, or perhaps more significantly, a written word to evoke response. In Brandon's evocation of Kant's account of freedom, we have no possibility of acting freely when we're compelled by physical laws. I mean, if the ceiling started dropping down, we're compelled by the forces of nature. We can't think it away. He says, the laws of nature bind us by compulsion. However, the institution of authority is human work. We bind ourselves with norms. Like Pierre, we can make a choice over whether we respond to the calls of duty or the desires of the heart by mediating our response through what Vygotsky calls auxiliary means. For instance, the toss of the coin. Obviously, that's a very simplistic example, but you can imagine all sorts of complex examples of how people mediate their responses to the world. It is through our capacity to be responsive to reasons and not just compelled by external force that permits our actions to be constrained by norms that we ourselves have instituted. These norms arise from the significance attributed to events, phenomena, resulting from activity in specific external conditions. So we can't just create any kind of way of mediating. We're constrained by our external circumstances, both ideal and material. As a result of the existence of norms, we see as, rather than simply see, the river as a source of food, the wilted flower as a sign of romance, the sizzling steak as an animal body part. As Sellers made clear, there is no simple given. We are in the world and therefore come to things according to purposes and circumstances as we transform nature and in so doing change ourselves. The attributions of significance arise in purposive activity. Representations are located in a network of relations, bringing what is a reason for what into view. Reasons are not arbitrary, but arise from a host of activities among communities and their material conditions, such as activities and practices that define women. Sorry, let me just get this right. It's obviously something that's holding me up a bit here. Define women as witches or physicists, as vulnerable or powerful. We commit ourselves to the correctness of a representation as governed by what we take to be its relation to other concepts, even if this turns out to be wrong in the end. The attribution of the concepts which, or indeed Brexit, entail a whole host of supporting reasons. For instance, the failures are due to magical causes, and the only way to overcome them is to remove the individuals responsible for them. The meaning of a concept varies as the inferential relations connecting it to other concepts change. Vygotsky notes that when a word is first learned, the development of its meaning has only just begun. As we use words in different circumstances, its meaning is adjusted as it functions in different ways. We become familiar with the norms governing its usage and respond to this usage, going along with it when appropriate, or challenging it when, for instance, school children subvert it. But the important thing is norms are in play, norms about what meaning is, governing what meaning is. And of course, this applied to Paul Nurse using a conceptual framework to test out his data, as it were, to make it perform in particular ways, or understand its performance in particular ways. However, it must be stressed that these relationships, then, are neither arbitrary nor open to willful change, but they do involve our responsiveness to reasons, the ongoing process of our making explicit what we have implicitly taken to be the case. To grasp the importance of these relationships, together with that of norms and systems of concepts, it's useful to turn to Yandell again. Yandell explores assumptions about knowledge through an account of 2 periods of teaching practice. The student-teacher fails in the first practice. His mentors see his problem as a lack of knowledge and are apparently unable to help him. In his teaching of Shakespeare, his responses to his pupils are inert and fail to pick up on what they're saying. He seemed unable to draw on any knowledge to support his responses. Yandell is surprised that during the second practice, when the student-teacher introduces his pupils to travel writing, there's a dramatic change in his ability to negotiate the classroom. The classroom is alive, but what has changed? Yandell's analysis is that his problem wasn't with travel writing or with Shakespeare. It was not knowledge in the abstract, but knowledge in the context of the pedagogic relations of schooling that were proving tricky for him. And the trickiness lay primarily in the pedagogic relations, not in the knowledge, insofar as they're in any sense separable. Yandel explains that in the first teaching practice, the mentors thought that the student-teacher had a problem of not having sufficient knowledge, but clearly the situation was more complex than that. So Yandel relates the difference between the two periods to the student's difficulty being viewed by his mentors in terms of knowledge in the abstract during the first practice. In the second, he successfully engages with knowledge in the context of pedagogic relations. As Yandel points out, the characterization of knowledge in the abstract misses something important. The phrase abstract knowledge has received bad press, but impoverished characterizations fail to recognize that disciplines are dynamic and develop continuously. However, this does not mean that they lack norms or rules that are necessary for engaging with the disciplines in the first place. Attention to a field or a domain of knowledge entails focusing on normativity. That is to say, it entails focusing on the normative constraints that delimit the matter being taught and govern how concepts function within the disciplines. The difficulty here is not only the lack of fine-grained working out of what is presupposed on both sides of the debate, but also the lack of dialogue between the sides. Only dialogue of a philosophical kind, i.e. one that makes explicit what is presupposed in each position, would expose both the real areas of disagreement. My argument is it's not abstract knowledge, but a representationalist orientation to knowledge, which prevented the student-teacher from responding appropriately during his first practice. Yandel's concern is that knowledge should not be treated as rarefied, as a possession of an individual, removed from the socio-semiotic processes that are implicated in, and I've used my own italics here, in the production of knowledge. By putting the issue in terms of the production of knowledge, he appears as representative of the meaning-making side of the debate. People will often talk about their students producing knowledge, and the Bible example, which is a rather caricatured example, was obviously the students producing their knowledge about the Bible. It's very different from John's rich account in his own paper, though. He asked them, what was the knowledge base of the lesson? Questioning the idea of fixed categories of knowledge, Yandel writes, a generic category was being produced through a series of generative activities, each of which was located in and made meaningful through the cultures and histories of the participants, cultures and histories that were simultaneously the material that was being worked on and the object of attention. So I think this begins to look like one side of the debate when it's presented in these terms, in terms of cultures and histories. He's concerned with placing emphasis on the social generation of knowledge, the student teacher's knowledge of how texts function and how meanings are made and remade. And this was evident in the teacher's questioning and his directing of the student's attention to how aspects of an advert functioned in relation to its persuasive design. The students' insightful and informed responses in the second teaching practice, when asked to design their own advert, demonstrated the success of the teacher's approach by supporting their engagement with the topic at a deep level. In the presentation of their advert, the students were able to demonstrate knowledge of a variety of the aspects of language, including different genres. So my dispute is not to say, or my slight difference from John Yandel is not to say that it wasn't an incredibly successful lesson where the students gained an enormous amount of knowledge through their constructive activities, as it were, but I'm questioning his analysis of it, or I'm trying to tweak his analysis of it. So the idea of the social here requires examination. It's often seen as the exclusive preserve of the sociologists, but philosophy has something to offer. The terms in which Yandel talks of the social at the level of cultures and histories of participants, I would argue, is insufficiently fine-grained. emphasis on the biographies of pupils and what they bring to the classroom as a source of the generation of knowledge is a common theme in constructivism. But to what extent can this account of the social deal with the nature of our responsiveness to reasons, or with one thing being able to stand for another? Does it have the analytic resources to do so? Without them, not only does Yandel's position appear opposed to a case for knowledge made by those concerned with facts, but those concerned with facts have no means to consider pedagogy or how learners access meaning. What neither side address is that a normative context is necessary for the idea of being in touch with the world at all, whether knowledgeably or not. Now, the nature of normativity is a complicated philosophical area, so I can only touch on it briefly here. Pupils studying English draw upon aspects of their cultural practices and express their own interpretations. But in doing so, they draw on language and apply words in sentences according to standards of correctness, i.e. according to the normative rules that govern the application of concepts and so govern a concept's meaning. So you need to stay focused when I talk about rules on the meaning rather than the grammar, as it were, because I'm talking about the standards of correctness in relation to meaning. Of course, that can involve grammar. Applying concepts according to accepted standards of correctness requires these standards be recognised, though not necessarily complied with. However, if they were not understood, communication would be impossible. But what are these standards of correctness? In an everyday context, according to the standards that apply to the use of the concept of insect, it's perfectly acceptable to refer to a spider as an insect. But in a specialised context, a different term, arachnid, ought to be used. The relation between concepts determine how any one concept functions and thus specify the rules for its application. In Yandel's example of the English lesson, students freely draw upon any resources that are meaningful for them, but in order to function persuasively, their crafting of their work must be responsive to reasons that are recognised and shared. Sharing here does not entail shared culture or biography, or not at that level if we want to get down to an analysis of it, but an agreement about what norms are in play. In order to communicate, it's necessary for the students to draw on recognised standards of correctness or rules of application, regardless of whether or not they comply with or invert or subvert such standards. The crucial point is they cannot ignore the rules. So in a sense, the rules have to be present in the way that the lesson is functioning for them to be responsive to them in the first place. Emphasising the significance of rules for meaning, Peregrine explains, meaning is not a thing stood for by an expression, as representationalists would have it, nor is it, in fact, a thing at all. It's rather a role the expression assumes vis-à-vis the rules that govern it. And I think this is a lot like, or bears some relation, I should say, to Feynman's comments at the beginning about not knowing the names. He's interested in the relations, because that's where the meaning is. Peregrine notes that it does not follow from this conception of meaning that inferentialism can be explained simply as a use theory of meaning. In his words, it's not claiming that something is the case, but rather urging that something ought to be the case. He explains, if during a chess game I say, this is a king, then what I'm likely to be expressing is not merely a fact, but also an urge. You cannot move the piece like this, for this would violate the rules that the piece is governed by. So it's a nice example of where something, due to its functioning in a set of relations, can act as the king on the chessboard. It is inferential articulation, the making explicit of what is implicit in the use of concepts in particular sentences, that allows the exercise of reason by students to understand the topic. In Yandel's case, the rules that govern the assertions made by students may well draw upon non-standard English, which, as Lobov argues, is not unconnected to standard English. The subject matter of English touches the lives of students, and because of this, it's directly related to the norms in play within the discipline itself. Mathematics does not touch students in the same direct fashion, but the normative rules function in a similar way to those which govern usage in English, for that matter, any knowledge domain. As regards to the concept of number, for instance, it can be understood as a quantitative aspect of a set of objects when calculating, for example, that 3 is bigger than 2. But if the concept of number is expanded to include negative numbers, the rules of how it is used are adjusted. In relation to history teaching, McCrory raises the question of what do we mean when we claim that students have historical knowledge. Students may repeat facts competently, but fail to show that they can use what they've learned. Substantive information is related to, but not responsive to what was actually asked. Despite a cleverly designed task to encourage students to explain the relative importance of particular causes in relation to a historical event, the dominance of the representationalist mode meant they interpreted the task as restricted to learning the facts instead of to developing causal arguments. According to McCrory, the students' reasoning was cut short, as they assume they understand sentences because they can identify the things in the world to which the words refer. To go beyond a repetition of facts, students need to attend to what is involved in the terms that they use. In philosophical terms, this means committing to the inferential relations that constitute the concepts they're using. Replicating the information provided by the teacher does not require the student to be aware of the commitments involved. McCrory stresses Vygotsky's point that the same words used by a student and teacher do not necessarily have the same meaning. It may appear strange, of course, but students can know what the details they have been provided with stand for, but have little knowledge of what follows from them. She notes the pressure on teachers to distort knowledge into its representationalist guise, severed from its inferentially determined meaning, and advocates an inferentialist approach that will allow teachers to provide the conditions in which reasoning can take place. To help students, she revised the lesson sequence to reveal the judgments implicit in the pupil's thinking. McCrory explains that what students write depends on their own network of inferential relations, and the task of the teacher is to influence these relations in a way that develops their conceptual awareness. These examples are intended to show the role of inferential rules, i.e. norms, in providing the conditions of reasoning. It's only when students are provided with the opportunity to develop their responsiveness to reasons, in particular knowledge domains, that they become able to take up commitments, i.e. to know what is being represented, and to be able to explore what commitments to particular relations between concepts entail. We could almost say it's only then that they can begin to think, as Dewey might put it. Indeed, it is only when students have the opportunity to develop their responsiveness to reasons that they can think critically. So let us now return to the example of the Bible. Students were engaged in meaning making, but what was the context in which this was taking place? Were the concepts to which they were being introduced through the activity of making a Bible, those of prophecy and law, within the normative constraints that govern the role of concepts involved in religious education? So this is a bit like my spider example. It's absolutely fine to call a spider an insect if you're not in a specialist situation. It can function perfectly well there, that concept. But when you're put into another situation where, as Peters would say, you're initiated into a knowledge domain, then the teacher has to have some awareness or has to be orientated towards those normative constraints. So, what were these normative constraints that would govern these roles in religious education? Were they introduced into the space of reasons roughly we could call it the conceptual framework or the conceptual system, in which knowledge about the Bible could arise? Or were their use of concepts shaped by the relation of consumer culture, with the result that the ideas bore little or no relation to the study of the Bible? The task I've used to illustrate the point here is taken from a scheme of work. So before I say something about that, I just want to stress this point, that the teacher wanted to help these students individually express their own meaning, but in that first instance, because there wasn't any kind of framing of what they were doing and any awareness for them of the particular norms constraining how concepts function in relation to the Bible, and there are many ways of putting this in place for the students were just left in consumer culture and quite understandably brought and drew upon those sorts of ways of understanding the concept of law or prophecy. So they bore little relation to the study of the Bible. The task I've used to illustrate, as I said, comes from a scheme of work. So the matter doesn't have to end here. How the teacher utilises the students' productions can make all the difference. If she's attentive to the normative constraints that govern standards of correctness for the area being studied, it is possible that the students' work is made relevant and meaningful by being counterposed to the rules that govern the use of the other non-biblical concepts of prophecy and law. So she could bring out the dissonance between their ways of thinking about the concept of prophecy in consumer culture in terms of a prediction of a shop going bust, and relate it to a richer sense of prophecy in the context of the Bible. If she does this, students will have the opportunity to reason within the subject domain of religious education. And of course, if she doesn't, they won't have that opportunity to think for themselves within that domain. Difficulties will almost certainly arise when knowledge is approached on the basis of the student's construction of meaning. But equally, these cannot be resolved by teaching facts, unless the facts are situated in a network of inferential relations. Access to these inferential relations can be provided in numerous ways. It may involve how a task is designed, as in the case of history, the history example I gave you, or by the quality of questioning, as in the example of an English lesson. But to underline the point of my argument here, neither meaning-making nor the presentation of facts are to be dismissed, but rather they have to be brought together through an inferential rather than a representational orientation to knowledge. So philosophy is not going to resolve this at least 50-year-old debate, but it does provide analytical resources for transcending it and by reformulating the presuppositions upon which it is based. So thank you.
Jan, thank you so much. That was absolutely riveting. What a provocation and stimulation to us all. This relationship between different concepts and meaning making and understanding is just, we're all going to be thinking about this on our trains on the way home, I think. And it was also really fascinating and gratifying to see the rich scholarship that you've drawn on in your lecture, including, of course, colleagues here at the IOE. I think that you've given us an enormous amount of food for thought, and really, again, we can see your scholarship in providing this significant contribution in a new lens to this 50-year-old debate, as you've termed it, in terms of the notions of knowledge and skills. And I'd now like to turn to introduce our respondent, Michael Young, who's Professor of Sociology of Curriculum at the IOE. Michael's main research interests are in the sociology of knowledge and its application to the curriculum, with particular reference to the post-compulsory phase of education and training. He's the author of many influential works, including Knowledge and Control, 1971, and Bringing Knowledge Back In, from social constructivism to social realism in the sociology of education, published in 2007. A leading sociologist and educational thinker, Michael was honorary or visiting professor at universities in the UK, China, South Africa, and New Zealand. In the last decade, Michael's contributed and continued to write about the importance of a critical focus on the question of knowledge in education, an issue that's gained renewed importance for both teachers and policymakers since the policies were introduced that are associated with Michael Gove and Nick Gibb. And in 2015, with Joe Muller, he published Curriculum and the Specialization of Knowledge. And just last year, IOE colleagues edited a festschrift in Michael's honour, Curriculum Studies and Professional Knowledge. So thank you for joining us this evening. Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much, Becky, for that very generous introduction. I felt very honoured when Jan invited me to respond to her lecture. This was on personal grounds as a colleague for many years, although I didn't realise it was 29, and also because of my great respect for her work as a philosopher. I don't think I've ever met anyone in my time at the Institute, and I'm sure this is not just a personal view, who's more generous with her time, her ideas, her contacts, and a willingness to share with others what she's found important than Jan. It's certainly been a continuing and ongoing great experience for me. The educational relevance of the work of the philosopher Robert Brandon, which has influenced her recently, and the original interpretation of Vygotsky, which she refers to in her lecture, are two cases in point, particularly to a sociologist who knows not a lot of philosophy or psychology. When all the pressures are on us to focus on our individual careers, Jan has been and continues to be an inspiration for what academic colleagueship should be about. I've only a brief time and make some brief comments on what she said this evening. Though much of it is apparently far removed from classroom realities, let alone education policy debates, her work goes to the heart of the pedagogic issues with which teachers are faced with every day in the classroom. If we, as education researchers and theorists, cannot help teachers understand how teaching and learning are meaning-making activities, how can we expect them to engage their pupils with school subjects? At a time when educational theory tends to be dismissed as having little practical relevance, it is symptomatic of Jan's approach that two of the key references she draws on in her lectures are not philosophers, but colleagues who devote much of their time to preparing the next generation of teachers. Jan's theory is radical in the sense of going back to the roots of educational problems. For her, their roots are in what makes human beings different from all and distinct from all other living beings, the way, in fact, we or they respond to the world. It's in our responsiveness to the world from the moment we are born that provides us with the resources to be able to be educated as we grow up, and in a sense to be educated almost whether we like it or not. The failure to recognize this is raised most acutely to me, and as Jan points out, in the currently fashionable focus on knowledge in educational policy. Knowledge as facts, to be specified in curricula and memorized for examinations. It is as if learning is an almost mechanical process of transmission and assimilation. Jan draws on the American philosopher Robert Brandon to focus on what she thinks, and I agree, is the most fundamental and yet disregarded human faculty, how we come to name the world with language, or as she elegantly expressed it from somebody I've not come across, Pellegrin, our peculiar ability of letting one thing stand for another. In naming the world, we interpret it as given, and as a result, we understand it, but often find it impossible to change. However, Jan argues that this givenness or everydayness is a myth. It masks the deeper reality that underpins it. In our search for meaning, we don't label it with words, we make inferential relationships about it in what Brandon describes as the giving and asking for reasons. How else could we do it when we actually stand back and think about it? We connect words to each other and with how others use them. For Brandon, this process of making inferential relationships is prior to representing the world in language, and is, as I said, I think the most basic capacity of human beings. For Jan and for us as educators, it not only means we're all born educable, but that it is the responsiveness of children are born with, that is the resource that teachers can draw on, and that makes human learning and teaching possible at all. This is no abstract theory. It has radical implications for education and specifically for pedagogy. Whereas the government's curriculum policy is to affirm the givenness by insisting on that knowledge is a list of contents to be transmitted by schools. The implications of Jan's analysis is that this merely affirms the givenness of the world and reduces the possibility of pupils learning and teachers helping them to learn, however good the curriculum may or may not be. It is little wonder that many pupils leave school without knowing much that they could not have learned without going to school at all, and only a few find the resources for transforming the knowledge they've acquired into understanding. Jan's alternative is that we start with how all children respond to the world. The same inferential relations that a child draws on in responding to the world are also the resource that teachers have for introducing students to the concepts of the curriculum. That, I think, is a very powerful and practical approach for teachers and for teacher educators. Reading Jan's text and listening to her lecture tonight left me with two questions, which are important and which I certainly have no easy answer to. However, this does not worry me, and I'm sure it doesn't worry Jan. It was Einstein, of all people, once, who when asked how would he recognize a good theory, his answer was, does it suggest any new questions? My first question is, how is it that we are born with these inferential capacities, the desire for knowledge, as Jacques Lacan put it, and yet they are mostly hidden from us, and we seem to lose them in growing up? Is this a product of our socialization or how we prepare teachers? It's a question for me. My second question, which is rather more perhaps contentious, arises out of the emphasis Jan places on meaning making. Of course, meaning making is fundamental. The question I'm left with is it enough if we're teachers? How does it help us as teachers in distinguishing between the meanings that pupils come with and bring to school and those that are offered by the curriculum? That is a question that is faced every day by teachers in every class. To put it in another way, don't we as teachers need a theory of truth as well as a theory of meaning? And as educational theorists, maybe we need an epistemology as well as a semantics. Jan, thank you very much for making me think again about almost everything I thought before.
Thank you so much, Michael. And of course, it's brilliant to finish with two questions, isn't it? Because, of course, one of the key points of philosophy is that the debate will continue. And this will certainly give us something to chat about over a glass of wine or juice waiting in the reception for you. And I'd like to invite you all to join us there. But not without, of course, first of all, thanking Jan for a fantastic, stimulating lecture, a very generous and engaged response from Michael, and thanks to you all for attending as well. Thanks very much.